the real reason humans started wearing clothes. The story begins not with a shivering man draping a fur over his shoulders, though that is the image every textbook reaches for. It begins with a louse. Specifically, it begins with the moment the body louse split from the head louse. That evolutionary fork in the road, that tiny genetic divergence, invisible to the naked eye, preserved in mitochondrial DNA like a fossil made of code, is the closest thing we have to a timestamp for the birth of clothing. For decades, anthropologists told a simple story. Humans started wearing clothes because the world got cold. Early Homo sapiens left Africa, wandered into Ice Age Eurasia, and suddenly needed something to keep warm. The logic seemed unassailable. No fur, no feathers, just bare skin in a frozen landscape. Put on a coat or die. But that story has a problem. A big one. Actually, several. The first problem is Africa itself. The oldest evidence for clothing, not the clothes themselves which rot, but the tools used to make them, comes from sites in South Africa's Blombos Cave and Deep Kloof rock shelter dating to around 100,000 years ago. That's 40,000 years before the major migration out of Africa. Humans were making clothes while they were still, for the most part, in Africa. And Africa, even during glacial periods, is not a place where you need a parka to survive the night. The second problem is the ice. The really serious cold didn't arrive until the last glacial maximum, about 25,000 years ago, but genetic evidence from body lice tells us clothing was already routine by 170,000 years ago, maybe earlier. That means humans started wearing clothes not because they had to, but because they chose to. And the difference between necessity and choice is the difference between a reflex and a revolution. So what changed? What made a naked ape decide to wrap itself in the skin of another animal? The answer, it turns out, has almost nothing to do with temperature and almost everything to do with three forces you would never guess: parasites, status, and the female orgasm. Let's start with the parasites, because before we wore clothes, we lived with bugs, not occasionally, constantly. Every second of every day. The head louse, Pediculus humanus capitis, is our oldest companion. It has been with us since before we were fully human, since the days of Homo erectus 2 million years ago, and it lives in hair, feeds on blood, lays eggs on shafts. Annoying, but manageable. Then sometime between 170,000 and 100,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. A population of head lice adapted to a new environment. Not a new host species, still humans, but a new microhabitat on the human body. They moved down. They started living not in the hair of the scalp, but in the fibers of something. Something that wasn't skin. Something that created a new ecological niche. That something was clothing. The body louse, Pediculus humanus corporis, cannot survive without clothing. It lays its eggs in fabric seams. It clings to woven fibers. If you take away a human's clothes, the body louse dies out within generations. Its very existence proves that clothing existed, and existed long enough for an entire new species to evolve. Mark Stoneking, the geneticist who ran this study at the Max Planck Institute in 2003, calculated the divergence date with molecular clocks. Roughly 107,000 years ago, give or take 30,000 years, that's our timestamp. That's when clothing became permanent. Not occasional, not ceremonial, permanent. But here's what the textbooks don't tell you. The lice themselves were the reason. Think about what life was like for a naked human, covered in head lice, the itching, the scratching, the open sores, the risk of secondary infection. Lice carry trench fever, relapsing fever, epidemic typhus. These diseases kill. Before modern hygiene, before antibiotics, a heavy louse infestation was not an inconvenience. It was a chronic health crisis that started at birth and ended at death. Now imagine the person who first figured out that if you wore a skin, just draped it over your shoulders, the lice on your body stopped. Not all of them. Not forever. But enough. Enough that the crawling sensation faded. Enough that you could sleep through the night without scratching yourself bloody. Enough that your children had fewer fevers. The first garment was not a coat. It was a barrier. And it worked brilliantly for about 3 generations. Then the body louse evolved. And suddenly, the thing that protected you from head lice became the perfect breeding ground for an even worse version. So a louse specialized for life in fabric, one that could multiply in your seams and crawl out to feed on you at night. The solution became a new problem. This pattern, invention, adaptation, escalation, would repeat itself across every subsequent clothing revolution. Wool brought clothes moths. Tight weaves brought body lice back stronger. Every fiber, every weave, every innovation triggered cursory counter-adaptation from the invisible world of insects and microbes. We were not masters of our clothing. We were participants in an arms race. But if parasites were the trigger, they weren't the only reason, because by the time the body louse diverged, humans had already started doing something else with clothing. They were using it to lie. Let me explain. The second great force behind clothing was what primatologists call deceptive signaling. In primate societies, status is written on the body. Dominant male baboons have bigger canine teeth. Silverback gorillas have, well, the silverback. Mandrills have bright red and blue faces. These are honest signals. They cannot be faked. You cannot grow bigger canines than you have. You cannot fake the hormonal changes that produce sexual swellings in female chimps. But humans lost most of those signals. We became, in the jargon of evolutionary biology, a hidden estrus species. Female humans do not visibly advertise ovulation. Male humans do not have intimidating natural weapons. Our faces don't change color with social rank. We entered a world where status had to be constructed, not displayed. Enter clothing. The first decorative clothing, beads, ochre-stained hides, feathers tied to leather thongs, appears in the archaeological record around the same time as the first permanent clothing. Blombos, cave, 100,000 years ago, contains perforated shell beads that show wear patterns consistent with being strung and worn for long periods. Not for warmth, for show. Here's where the conventional wisdom inverts itself entirely. We think of clothing as something that hides. The fig leaf in the Garden of Eden, the burqa, the business suit covering the naked body beneath. But the archaeological evidence suggests the opposite. The first clothes were not about covering up. They were about standing out. A hide painted with ochre is not less visible than bare skin. It is more visible. A necklace of shells clatters. Feathers move in the wind. The earliest clothing was loud, literally and figuratively. It announced presence. It declared resources. It said, I have the time and skill and social support to make this thing, and you do not. This is what anthropologists call costly signaling theory. A peacock's tail is costly to grow and carry. It slows escape from predators, requires energy to maintain. That's precisely why it works as a signal. Only a fit peacock can afford such a handicap. Similarly, a fine hide decorated with hundreds of shell beads requires hours of labor to prepare, string, and maintain. Only a person with good hunting skills, good social connections to acquire the shells which came from the coast tens of kilometers away, and good health can produce such an object. The garment is the peacock's tail, but here's where it gets truly strange. And this is the part that almost no one talks about. The third reason humans started wearing clothes, the one that revisionist historians avoid, the one that changes everything you think you know about modesty and shame and the birth of civilization, has to do with sex. Not reproduction, not pair bonding, not the things you learned in health class, something else entirely. It starts with a simple observation that has troubled anthropologists for over a century. Human females are unique among primates in having concealed ovulation. A female chimp in estrus has a bright pink swelling on her rear that screams "now" to every male in the vicinity. A female human ovulates in silence. No swelling, no scent, no visible cue. The standard explanation, the one you'll find in textbooks by Sarah Blaffer Hrdy and others, is that concealed ovulation encouraged pair bonding. If a male doesn't know when a female is fertile, the reasoning goes, he'd better stick around and keep having sex with her to ensure his paternity. Voila, monogamy, the family, civilization. But this explanation has never quite worked. For one thing, it assumes that males would only invest in offspring if they were certain of paternity, but human males invest massively in children, even in cultures with no paternity certainty. For another, it doesn't explain why concealed ovulation evolved in the first place before pair bonding would have selected for it. It's circular. A different explanation has been proposed by a small handful of heterodox thinkers, most notably the evolutionary biologist Randy Thornhill and the anthropologist C. Owen Lovejoy, though even they tiptoe around the full implications. Here it is. Concealed ovulation combined with permanent breast enlargement and the loss of estrus signaling turned human females into continuous sexual receptacles. Not because nature intended it that way, because males selected it that way. Bear with me. This is the missing link between the body louse and the designer gown. In most primate species, female sexual receptivity is limited to the fertile window, a few days per month, maybe a week. Outside that window, the female is not interested and the male's advances are rebuffed. But among humans, sex happens year-round. It happens during pregnancy. It happens during lactation. It happens after menopause. The human female is biologically capable of sexual response at any time in any cycle phase. For decades, this is not normal for mammals. It is highly derived, something selected for it. Thornhill's argument, laid out in his controversial 2000 book, A Natural History of Rape, which I am not endorsing in full but engaging with on this specific point, is that continuous female receptivity evolved because it reduced male coercion. A female who never says "not now" is a female who never gets forced. But that's only half the story. The other half is that continuous receptivity turned sex into a social tool. Sex became about bonding, conflict resolution, stress reduction, barter, manipulation, pleasure, everything except reproduction most of the time. And that is where clothing enters the picture, Raish. Because if sex is happening all the time, and if it's happening between individuals who are not necessarily mates, and if it's happening in the context of complex social alliances, then the body itself becomes a problem. Not the naked body, the unmarked body. Think about the social dynamics of a hunter-gatherer band, say 30 people, all of whom have seen each other naked since birth. In that context, nudity carries no erotic charge. It's just bodies. But that's precisely the problem. If everyone is equally naked, there is no way to signal availability, non-availability, preference, status, or intent through the body alone. You need adornment. The earliest clothing did not hide the genitals. That came much, much later, probably with agriculture and property, and the need to mark female bodies as belonging to specific males. No, the earliest clothing decorated the rest of the body. Waist belts made of twisted plant fibers, necklaces of teeth, armbands of feathers, ochre patterns painted on the chest and thighs. These were not obscuring the body, they were writing on the body. Consider the female orgasm, that famously non-functional trait that has puzzled evolutionary biologists since Darwin. Unlike male orgasm, which is obviously tied to ejaculation and reproduction, female orgasm has no clear reproductive function. Women can conceive without it. Many women rarely or never experience it. So why does it exist? One answer, proposed by the anthropologist Donald Simons in the 1970s, and later supported by the work of Elizabeth Lloyd, is that female orgasm is a byproduct of male orgasm, a developmental holdover, like male nipples. The clitoris and the penis develop from the same embryonic tissue. Orgasm is what happens when that tissue is stimulated. No special adaptation required. But that answer has never satisfied everyone. Another possibility proposed by Sarah Blaffer, Hurdy, and others is that female orgasm evolved as a mate selection mechanism. Women who orgasm more easily with certain partners, the theory goes, are more likely to choose those partners. Orgasm becomes a reward system for good genes, good behavior, good provision. But here is the radical possibility, the one that connects to clothing. Female orgasm, specifically its unpredictability and its dependence on context and mood and safety, may be the evolutionary reason women started covering their bodies. Not because nudity is shameful, but because nudity is distracting. In a species where sex happens constantly, the sight of an unadorned body, especially an unfamiliar body, can trigger sexual response, whether the observer wants it or not. This is not a moral failing. It is a neurological fact. The human visual system is wired to respond to skin, to symmetry, to the cues of fertility. Response happens below the threshold of conscious control. Clothing interrupts that response. It adds a layer of processing, a cognitive speed bump. Before the visual signal of naked body can reach the limbic system, the cortex has to classify the garment, decode its signals, assess its meaning. That fraction of a second is enough. Enough to transform automatic response into considered choice. This is not a theory about modesty. Modesty, the feeling of shame about nudity, is a cultural construct that varies wildly across time and place. The Yanomami of the Amazon wear almost nothing and feel no shame. Victorian women felt shame about showing an ankle. Modesty is learned. But distraction is not learned. Distraction is automatic. Clothing, in this view, is the original boundary management system. It is the first technology of social distance. It says, this body is not available to you right now. Read the signals. Respect the signals. And the signals from the very beginning have been a language more complex than any spoken tongue. A hide tanned soft enough to drape says something different than a stiff hide. A garment that ends at the knee says something different than one that ends at the ankle. Ochre patterns on the chest are not the same as ash patterns. Feathers from a raven are not the same as feathers from an eagle. Every choice, every fiber, every dye, every stitch is a sentence in a conversation about who you are, who you want to be, who you will accept, who you reject, where you stand in the hierarchy, what you have lost, what you remember, what you hope. The real reason humans started wearing clothes is not one thing. It is all of these things at once, layered like the garments themselves. It is the louse that drove us to cover ourselves and then evolved to live in the covering. It is the peacock's tail, the costly signal that says, I am wealthy enough to wear this useless, beautiful thing. It is the hidden ovulation, the continuous receptivity, the sexual signal that must be switched on and off, not by biology, but by cloth. It is the orgasm that depends on safety, and the safety that depends on not being seen as available when you are not. It is the oldest story ever told, written not in words, but in weaves, and we have been telling it to ourselves on our own skin for 2,000 centuries. The louse that changed history. Let us now speak directly of the creature that knows our secrets better than any historian ever will. It has no eyes, yet it saw our every migration. It has no memory, yet it preserved the date of our most intimate invention. It lives its entire existence in the folds of our cast-off skins, and in return for that hospitality it gives us typhus, the body louse, pediculus humanus corporis. To understand why humans started wearing clothes, you must first understand that we did not decide to wear them on a Tuesday morning in a moment of sudden inspiration. There was no inventor, no patent, no first man who looked at a dead deer and said, I shall drape this over my shoulders. Clothing emerged from a million small experiments, most of which failed, over a period so long that the very concept of first loses meaning. But the louse does not care about our philosophical difficulties. The louse knows only one thing. There was a time when it could not live on us, and then there was a time when it could. The boundary between those two times is the boundary between the naked human and the clothed human. And that boundary, etched in mitochondrial DNA, is the closest thing to a confession we will ever get. The Great Divergence. Mark Stoneking did not set out to solve the mystery of the first shirt. He was a geneticist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, and his specialty was the molecular clock, the use of DNA mutations to date evolutionary events. In the late 1990s, he and his colleagues were mapping the family tree of lice. Not because lice are glamorous, because lice are intimate. A louse cannot survive away from its host for more than 24 hours. It cannot jump, cannot fly, can barely crawl. It is passed from body to body by touch, by shared bedding, by the slow press of bodies in sleep. This means that the evolutionary history of lice is the evolutionary history of human contact. When human populations split, their lice split with them. When humans invented new habitats on their own bodies, new niches like the inside of a sleeve or the seam of a waistband, the lice that adapted to those niches became new species. Stoneking's team collected lice from around the world, head lice from school children in Nepal, body lice from homeless shelters in Bangladesh, pubic lice, a different genus entirely, Euthyrus pubis, which is actually more closely related to gorilla lice than to human head lice. But that is another story from clinics in Thailand. They sequenced the DNA and built phylogenetic trees. What they found was stunning. The head louse and the body louse are genetically distinct. They do not interbreed. They occupy different microenvironments on the same host. The scalp versus the clothing. And they have been separate for so long that they have accumulated fixed genetic differences. Stone King's molecular clock placed the divergence between Pediculus humanus capitis and Pediculus humanus corporis at approximately 107,000 years ago, with a confidence interval stretching from 72,000 to 142,000 years ago. Let that sink in. 107,000 years ago, give or take, a population of head lice began to live in clothing. Not in fur, not in grass shelters, in woven or draped material that stayed with the human body continuously. The louse does not lie. It cannot. It has no motive. It does not care about the reputation of its host species. It simply reproduces, mutates, adapts, survives, and its DNA says, clothing existed as a permanent ecological niche by the late Middle Pleistocene. But here's the twist that the headlines missed. Stone King's date, 107,000 years ago, is not the date when the first hide was draped over a shoulder. It is the date when clothing became permanent, when humans started wearing something every day, all day, not just occasionally. Because only permanent clothing creates a stable enough environment for a new louse species to evolve. So when did humans first experiment with clothing? Earlier? Much earlier, maybe 200,000 years ago, maybe 300,000. We don't know. But we know that for tens of thousands of years, humans probably wore clothes sometimes, for ceremonies, for cold nights, for hunting in rain, and then took them off again. The head louse, encountering fabric occasionally, could not adapt. There wasn't enough time between exposures. The selection pressure was intermittent. Then something changed. Humans started wearing clothes continuously, all the time, even in warm weather, even during the day, even when they were not cold. And that shift, that seemingly small behavioral change, opened a new world for a small population of head lice that happened to have a mutation allowing them to grip slightly different fibers, to lay eggs in seams rather than on hair shafts, to thrive in the darkness between skin and hide. Those lice became body lice, and they have been with us ever since, the plague in the seams. But if body lice evolved to live in clothing, why would that drive humans to keep wearing clothing? Wouldn't the lice make clothing less desirable? This is the paradox that most evolutionary stories gloss over. The standard narrative, humans invented clothes to stay warm, has no room for parasites. But the parasite narrative is more subtle. It goes like this. Humans occasionally wear hides for warmth or ceremony. Head lice are a constant nuisance, but they live only on the scalp. The rest of the body is relatively louse-free because head lice cannot grip body hair effectively. A small population of head lice adapts to living in the fibers of hides. These proto-body lice now infest not just the scalp, but the entire torso, arms, and legs. They are worse than head lice. They cause intense itching, skin lesions, and, crucially, they are vectors of disease. Humans now face a choice. They can stop wearing clothes, in which case the body louse population collapses. It cannot survive on bare skin, or they can continue wearing clothes and develop countermeasures. smoking the hides, treating them with insecticidal plants, changing garments frequently, washing when possible, burning infested clothing. Humans choose both. They stop wearing some clothes, the heavy, permanent day and night garments that enabled the louse in the first place, but they continue wearing other clothes, lighter garments, garments that can be removed at night, garments that are treated with ash or insect-repelling plants. And over time, they develop a new relationship with clothing. It is still worn, but it is managed, rotated, cleaned, replaced. The body louse in this reading is not a reason to start wearing clothes. It is a reason to refine the wearing of clothes, to make clothing lighter, more breathable, easier to remove and clean, to invent the change of clothes, to invent laundry. And here's the evidence that supports this reading. The oldest surviving fiber fragments from Ohalo II in Israel, dating to 19,000 years ago, and from Zuzwana cave in Georgia, dating to 30,000 years ago, are not heavy hides. They are plant fibers, flax, twisted into cords and woven into something that looks like a loose mesh or a net. Not warm, not protective against cold, but open, breathable, hard for lice to colonize because the gaps between fibers are too large for eggs to adhere securely. The first clothes were not winter coats. They were summer clothes, light, airy, and, this is the key, removable. The disease connection. We cannot understand the louse without understanding what the louse carries. Typhus, trench fever, relapsing fever. These are not mild illnesses. Epidemic typhus caused by Rickettsia prowazekii has killed more people in wartime than bullets. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow was not destroyed by Russian soldiers. It was destroyed by lice. The Grand Army entered Russia with 500,000 men and left with 10,000. The majority died not of cold, not of hunger, but of typhus, spread by body lice living in the seams of their frozen uniforms. In World War I, trench fever disabled over 1 million soldiers. The symptoms: sudden fever, severe headache, pain in the shins, relapse after relapse. The vector, the body louse. The environment, wool uniforms that were never washed, worn for months in muddy trenches. The louse thrived, and the soldiers paid. But these are modern examples. The ancient reality was worse because ancient populations had no immunity and no treatment. The first time a human population encountered rickettsia from a louse, the mortality rate may have approached 40%. Whole bands may have been wiped out. Now consider the implication. If body lice evolved around 100,000 years ago, then by 80,000 years ago, they had spread across the human range, and with them, the diseases they carried. Humans living in warm climates, Africa, the Levant, India, would have been at highest risk because they could not rely on cold to suppress louse populations. In fact, body lice thrive in moderate temperatures. Not too hot, they desiccate above 35 degrees Celsius. Not too cold, they slow reproduction below 15 degrees Celsius. Exactly the temperatures of human bodies in human shelters and human climates. So what did early humans do about this? They did what humans always do. They innovated. The archaeological record of the Middle Stone Age in Africa, roughly 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, is full of evidence for insect control, plant resins with insecticidal properties, ashes which are desiccating and abrasive to louse exoskeletons, ochre, which may have been used not just as pigment, but as a drying agent and physical barrier. The famous red ochre from Blombos cave, ground into powder and mixed with fat to create a paste, not just body paint, but insect repellent. We know from ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers that body lice are a constant preoccupation. The Kung San of the Kalahari, studied by Richard Lee in the 1960s, spent hours each day picking lice from their clothing and hair. They made combs from bone. They burned infested garments. They shared knowledge of which plants repelled lice and which did nothing. The louse was not an occasional pest. It was a daily reality, as present as hunger or thirst. And the San, like their ancestors 100,000 years ago, wore very little clothing in the heat of the day. They were not ashamed of nudity. They simply did not need clothes when the temperature was 40 degrees Celsius. But at night, when the temperature dropped, they draped themselves in skins, and those skins, if worn continuously, became louse habitats. So they did not wear them continuously. They wore them when needed, removed them when not, and turned the nightly battle against lice into a social ritual. Sitting in a circle, picking through seams, chatting and laughing while small white eggs were crushed between fingernails. This is the missing dimension of the clothing story. Not just when humans started wearing clothes, but how they managed the consequences. The molecular clock. Revisited Stone King study was published in 2003 in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution. It was immediately controversial, not because the methods were flawed, but because the implications were uncomfortable for a generation of anthropologists who had built careers on the out of Africa with a parka model. If clothing existed 107,000 years ago, then humans were wearing clothes in Africa, while the Neanderthals in Europe were mostly naked. Neanderthals lived in Ice Age Europe for 300,000 years. They had no body lice. Do with that fact what you will. But a later study by David Reed and colleagues in 2004 refined the date. Reed used a larger sample of lice and a more sophisticated molecular clock calibrated with known rates of louse evolution. His team pushed the divergence back. Not 107,000 years ago, but 170,000 years ago, with a range from 80,000 to 220,000. That is a wide range. That is the sound of a molecular clock not quite sure of its own ticking. But even the lower end of Reed's range, 80,000 years ago, is still older than the major human migrations out of Africa. Still older than the last glacial maximum. Still too old to be explained by cold. And Reed's upper end, 220,000 years ago, is almost incomprehensible. That is before the emergence of anatomically modern humans, according to some models. That would mean that Homo heidelbergensis, or early Homo sapiens, was wearing clothes. The louse does not care about species boundaries. It cares only about fabric. So where does the truth lie? We cannot know for certain, but we can triangulate. The oldest unambiguous bone awls, tools used to punch holes in hide for sewing, come from sites in France and Germany, dating to about 45,000 years ago, but that does not mean sewing is only 45,000 years old. It means that preserved bone awls are only 45,000 years old. Awls made of wood or thorn or sharpened bone that has since decayed could be much older. The oldest eyed needles, bone needles with a hole for thread, are from Siberia about 40,000 years ago. That is a different technology. Not just punching holes, but stitching. That implies tailored clothing that fits the body closely. Tailored clothing is more louse-friendly because it creates tight seams and dark folds. So the appearance of eyed needles around 40,000 years ago may mark a second major shift, from draped or loosely wrapped clothing to fitted clothing. And that shift would have triggered another louse adaptation, another molecular divergence. But we have not yet found that divergence in the louse genome. Either it is there and we have not looked in the right place, or the shift to tailored clothing happened so recently that the lice have not yet speciated. The louse, in other words, is still telling its story. We are still learning to listen. The unasked question. There is a question that no one asked in the louse studies because no one thought to ask it. It is a question about the absence of evidence. If body lice evolved 100,000 to 170,000 years ago, then head lice have been separated from body lice for that long. But head lice themselves are much, much older. Stone King's earlier work, 1999, estimated that head lice first colonized humans around 1.5 million years ago, when Homo erectus was roaming Africa and Asia. That means humans have had head lice for over 1 million years. And for most of that million years, humans did not have body lice. What changed? What allowed body lice to evolve then and not earlier? The obvious answer is that something about human behavior changed around 170,000 years ago, something that created a new ecological niche, something that made clothing a permanent part of the human body. But here is the unasked question. Was that change voluntary? Consider the possibility that clothing did not start as a choice. It started as a byproduct. A hide used as a sitting mat becomes a bed, becomes a blanket, becomes a garment. Not because someone decided to invent clothing, but because the hide was useful for sitting, then for sleeping under, then for draping over the shoulders while walking. The first garment was not a garment. It was a blanket that got up and walked. And then, once that blanket was being carried everywhere, the louse adapted. And then once the louse adapted, the blanket could not be put down. Because putting it down meant leaving behind not just warmth, but also the disease vector that had evolved to live in it. The blanket was now a louse habitat whether you wore it or not. If you left it on the ground, the lice would crawl off and wait for you to return. If you burned it, you lost the hide. If you kept wearing it, you kept the lice. The only solution was to make more blankets, to rotate them, to wash them, to treat them with insecticidal plants, to build a whole technology of louse management. And that technology, the second hide, the spare, the laundry, is what drove the evolution of textiles. Because hides are heavy, thick, hard to wash. Plant fibers are light, washable, dry quickly. The shift from hides to woven fabrics may have been driven not by comfort or fashion, but by parasite control. Weaving, in this view, is a louse management technology. A finely woven linen garment can be washed in water and dried in the sun, both of which kill lice and their eggs. A heavy fur cannot. So as body lice became more widespread, the selective pressure shifted from wear something to wear something you can clean. And that pressure led to the domestication of flax, the invention of the loom, the birth of textile production. And from there, everything else followed. The loom led to surplus, to trade, to specialization, to cities, to civilization, all because a louse needed a place to lay its eggs, the louse in the age of fashion. We are not done with lice. They are still here. In fact, body lice are making a comeback in the 21st century in homeless shelters, refugee camps, and disaster zones. They are still spreading typhus. In 2020, an outbreak of louse-borne typhus was reported in Los Angeles County, the first in decades. The vectors, body lice. The environment, unwashed clothing, crowded conditions, lack of laundry facilities. We think of ourselves as clean. We think of clothing as a choice, a fashion statement, an expression of personality. But the louse knows the truth. Our clothing is still a habitat. We still wash it because if we didn't, the insects would return, and not just insects, bacteria, fungi, the microbiome of clothing, the invisible ecosystem living in our seams, is as real as the microbiome of our guts. We cannot escape it. We can only manage it. The real reason humans started wearing clothes viewed through the lens of the louse is not a single reason. It is a cascade, a chain of accidents and adaptations that began with a blanket and ended with a tailored suit. We did not choose to wear clothes. We stumbled into clothing. And then we could not stop wearing them because the alternative, returning to a state of permanent, disease-ridden, louse-infested nakedness, was no longer available. We burned the bridge behind us, and the bridge was made of hair, and the fire was the first laundry day. The 100,000-year-old bead. Let us now hold a bead in our hands. It is small, perhaps the size of a lentil. It is made from the shell of a marine snail called Neisseris crausianus, a creature that lived in shallow waters off the southern coast of Africa when the world was a different place. The bead is perforated. A hole has been punched through its whorl, carefully, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And that hole is the oldest evidence of human symbolic thought we have ever found. The bead came from Blombos Cave, a rock shelter perched on the cliffs of the Western Cape in South Africa, overlooking the Indian Ocean. Beginning in 1991, excavations at Blombos have yielded a trove of artifacts that have forced archaeologists to rewrite the timeline of human cognitive evolution. In the uppermost Middle Stone Age levels, dated by optically stimulated luminescence to approximately 75,000 years ago, the team led by Christopher Henshelwood found 41 perforated tick shell beads. Not one or two beads, but 41, enough to be sure, enough to silence the skeptics. 39 of these beads came from the upper M1 phase, 2 from the slightly older M2 phase. Their perforations were not accidental. Taphonomic and microscopic analysis of modern Neisseris shells showed that natural wear does not produce the kinds of holes seen on the Blombos specimens. The perforations were made deliberately, using a sharp bone point thrust through the shell wall from the interior, a technique that requires skill and intent. But the most convincing evidence that these were worn as ornaments, rather than, say, strung for some purely functional purpose, is the wear pattern. Use wear has been recorded on the perforation edge, the outer lip, and the parietal wall of the aperture of the shells. This kind of wear is consistent only with the shells having been suspended, probably on a cord, and rubbed against each other or against the body over a long period of time. These were not freshly made beads thrown into a grave. They were worn. They lived with someone, moved with someone, were touched and seen by others. Furthermore, 31 of the beads were found in 4 small clusters of 5 to 12 beads each. Each cluster recovered in a single square or 2 adjacent squares during a single excavation day. Within each cluster, the shells display similar shades, wear patterns, and perforation sizes, suggesting that they originated from the same beadwork item, probably a single necklace or tassel that was lost or discarded in a single event. Someone dropped their jewelry 75,000 years ago, and we found it. The symbolic significance of these beads is in the measured language of academic archaeology, likely. But let us translate. These beads mean that 75,000 years ago, and as we shall see, even earlier, humans were doing something that had no practical purpose whatsoever. A nefarious bead does not keep you warm. It does not help you hunt. It does not protect you from rain or parasites. It is pure signal. As archaeologist Curtis Marian, a co-author of the ostrich shell study, put it at the time, the bead discoveries show that early cultural complexity, and thus likely modern human behavior, was widespread in Africa far earlier than in Europe. This is the great divergence in reverse. Not humans becoming modern in Europe 40,000 years ago, but humans already modern in Africa twice that long ago. Not everyone was convinced. Randall White of New York University, a respected expert on Paleolithic personal ornaments, expressed skepticism that the holes were human-made at all. "I'm disturbed by the fact that there are no tool traces," he said. Richard Klein of Stanford University agreed, suggesting the perforations could be accidental. But Hengelwood countered that the holes were almost certainly made by a sharp stone point, and that the worn areas on the lips of the holes could only have come from being suspended. The skeptics had a point, but subsequent discoveries have overwhelmingly supported Hengelwood. Perforated shells dated to even earlier periods have since been found elsewhere in Africa, and the Blombos beads fit into a broader pattern of symbolic activity at the site. Engraved ochre, bone tools, and, most remarkably, ochre processing kits that are essentially the world's oldest paint-making workshop. The Ochre Revolution. Ochre, red iron oxide, soft and colorful, is not a rare substance, but its presence in archaeological sites is rarely accidental. At Blombos, ochre appears in abundance, and not just as raw lumps. In 2011, researchers announced the discovery of an ochre-rich mixture possibly used for decoration, painting, and skin protection 100,000 years ago, stored in 2 abalone shells. This is not simple ochre. It is a processed pigment. Red ochre, ground to a powder and mixed with seal fat, charcoal, and other ingredients to create a paint-like substance that could be applied to skin, hides, or perhaps even woven materials. This workshop at Blombos, dated to around 100,000 years ago, is among the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the past 2 decades. Here, in a cave on the southern tip of Africa, humans were not just using color, they were manufacturing it. They were mixing, grinding, storing, and presumably applying pigments to their bodies or their clothing. The abalone shells used as containers still bear the stains of red ochre, as vivid today as when they were discarded 100,000 years ago. Why would early humans go to such trouble? The answer, again, is not warmth. Ochre does not insulate. It does not repel rain. It may have had some insect repellent properties. The pigment can dry out the skin and create a physical barrier against biting insects and perhaps lice, but that is not the primary explanation. Ochre is visible. It is bright. It marks the body in a way that cannot be ignored. Consider the social landscape of a Middle Stone Age band. 30 people, perhaps 50, living together, seeing each other naked or nearly so every day. How do you distinguish yourself? How do you signal your status, your achievements, your alliances, your availability? In a world without clothing as we know it, the body itself is the only canvas. And ochre is the first paint. But ochre is not the only early adornment. At Deep Kloof Rock Shelter, also in South Africa, archaeologists have recovered 408 engraved pieces of ostrich eggshell, dating to approximately 60,000 years ago. These are not random scratches. The engravers applied a restricted set of geometric patterns, with two main motifs dominant: a hatched band and a series of sub-parallel converging lines. These are not doodles, these are conventions, shared symbolic patterns that must have been recognized by the community. Deep Kloof's engraved ostrich shells were containers, not ornaments. The eggshells were shaped into flasks that could hold water or stored food, but the engravings were not necessary for the containers to function. They were purely decorative. And the fact that a restricted set of motifs was used repeatedly by multiple people over a long period suggests that these patterns carried meaning. They identified the container's owner, perhaps, or its contents, or the social group to which the owner belonged. Whatever the specific meaning, the general principle is clear. Early humans were using visual symbols to communicate complex social information. The Deep Kloof engravings are the earliest reliable evidence of what is a widespread modern practice, according to the team that studied them. The standardized production of repetitive patterns, including a hatched band motif, suggests a system of symbolic representation in which collective identities and individual expressions are clearly communicated. In other words, by 60,000 years ago, humans were not just decorating themselves. They were participating in a symbolic economy, a shared visual language that bound the group together and distinguished it from others. The costly signal. But why invest so much effort in decorations that have no obvious material benefit? The answer lies in a theory from evolutionary biology that most archaeologists have been reluctant to embrace: costly signaling. Peacock's tail is beautiful, but it is also heavy, cumbersome, and metabolically expensive to grow. It hinders escape from predators and requires constant maintenance. That is precisely why it works as an honest signal of male fitness. Only a healthy, well-fed peacock can afford to drag such a handicap around. The tail is not a convenient signal. It is costly. And the cost guarantees its honesty. The same logic applies to early human adornments. A necklace of Nacerius shells required the maker to travel to the Coast Blombos cave is several kilometers from the nearest source of Nacerius shells. Collect the shells, remove the animals, clean the shells, perforate each one with a bone point, a task requiring fine motor skills and patience. String them and then wear them. None of this was quick or easy. The bead maker paid a cost, but that cost was not wasted. It was invested. In a small hunter-gatherer band, everyone knows roughly how capable and how honest everyone else is. A person wearing a fine necklace of marine shells is signaling to the group, "I have the time, the skill, the social connections, and the physical health to produce this object. I am not a marginal member of this community. I am central, respected, and you should treat me accordingly. This is not vanity. This is social strategy. In a species that depends on cooperation for survival, signaling your value to the group is not optional. It is essential.
and the most effective signals are precisely those that are costly to produce. Cheap signals, a leaf tucked behind the ear, are not believed because anyone could produce them. Expensive signals, 100 carefully perforated shells, are believed because they demonstrate something real about the signaler. The 41 beads from Blombos Cave are not just ornaments. They are a receipt for investment. They are labor made visible, skill made tangible, and they are the beginning of a trajectory that would culminate tens of thousands of years later in the spectacular, beaded costumes of the Upper Paleolithic. The beaded dead. If Blombos shows the birth of personal adornment, Sungir, a site in central Russia, shows its apotheosis. Dated to between 30,000 and 26,000 years ago, Sungir is a seasonal hunting camp of early modern humans, living at the northern edge of the habitable world during the last glacial maximum. But the site is not famous for its dwellings or its stone tools. It is famous for its burials. 3 individuals were interred at Sungir with grave goods of staggering richness. A man buried alone wore clothing decorated with 2,936 mammoth ivory beads. He also wore ivory armlets stained with red and black paint. Nearby, 2 children, a boy of about 13 and a girl of about 8, were buried head to head, perhaps siblings. Their costumes were even more heavily ornamented than the man's. The boy with 4,903 beads, the girl with 5,274 beads. Let those numbers sink in. Over 13,000 ivory beads in a single grave site. Each bead was made by hand from mammoth tusk ivory, a material that is tough, brittle, and difficult to work. The beads are small, a few millimeters in diameter, and each one had to be shaped, smoothed, and drilled by hand using stone tools. Experimental archaeology has shown that producing a single ivory bead takes at least an hour of skilled labor. For the Sungir beads, then, we are looking at more than 13,000 person-hours of work. That is several years of full-time labor by a single craftsperson or many hands working for months. Who did this work? The skeletons themselves offer a clue. The girl's skeleton shows signs of repetitive stress, consistent with bead making, the kind of wear on the hands and wrists that comes from hours of fine manipulation. It seems likely that bead production was women's work at Sungir, as it has been in many ethnographic societies. The girl who is buried with over 5,000 beads may have helped to make them. But why invest so much labor in items that would be buried with the dead, removed forever from circulation? The answer is status. The Sungir burials are not egalitarian. These are individuals of extraordinary importance, chiefs perhaps, or ritual specialists, or members of a founding lineage. The thousands of beads on their clothing are not just decoration. They are a public statement of the social order. Some people are more valuable than others, and these people are the most valuable of all. The Sungir beads also tell us something else. Clothing had become a primary medium for social display. By 30,000 years ago, the human body in colder climates was wrapped in fur and hide from head to toe, leaving almost no skin visible. The old canvas, the naked body, was gone, but the human need to signal had not disappeared. It had simply been transferred. Instead of painting their skin, people decorated their clothes. This is a profound shift. Ian Gilligan, the Australian archaeologist who has done more than anyone to theorize the origins of clothing, argues that eyed needles, which appear around 40,000 years ago, made this transfer possible. Bone needles with eyes allow much finer sewing than bone awls alone, making possible multiple layers of fitted clothing. And once people were wearing multiple layers continuously, skin decoration became impossible. The social functions of altering one's appearance had to be transferred from decorating naked skin to clothes, Gilligan says. And eyed needles were required to accomplish this kind of intricate sewing. The Denisova needle, discovered in a Siberian cave and dated to approximately 50,000 years ago, is the world's oldest known eyed needle. It was made by Denisovans, an extinct hominin species, before modern humans even arrived in Siberia. 7 centimeters long, crafted from a large bird bone, it has a carefully carved eye for thread. This is not a crude awl. This is a precision tool for tailoring. By 50,000 years ago, the concept of fitted clothing that follows the contours of the body and can be worn in multiple layers, was already well established among at least one hominin lineage. The tools of the trade. The sun gear beads, stunning as they are, tell only part of the story. To make clothing, you need more than decorations. You need the tools to work hides, to punch holes, to sew. In 2021, a team led by Emily Hallett announced a discovery from Contrebandiers cave in Morocco that pushed back the earliest firm evidence of clothing production by tens of thousands of years. The researchers unearthed 62 bone tools, dated to between 120,000 and 90,000 years ago. 7 of these tools were hide scrapers, flat, spatula-shaped implements made from split antelope or cattle ribs, with short, deep grooves and polish, consistent with scraping animal skins. Alongside these tools, the team found animal bones with cut marks, matching the pattern created by skinning. Detaching the hide from the paws and pulling it over the head in one piece. The evidence is unambiguous. By 120,000 years ago, humans were systematically processing animal hides, probably to make clothing. Hallett's interpretation is cautious but clear. These bone tools have shaping and use marks that indicate they were used for scraping hides to make leather and for scraping pelts to make fur. In other words, people were making both leather and fur garments. They were not just draping fresh hides over their shoulders. They were manufacturing clothes. The Moroccan finds are consistent with the Laos-based estimate for the origin of clothing. Body lice diverged from head lice around 170,000 to 100,000 years ago, and hide scrapers appear in the archaeological record at roughly the same time. These two independent lines of evidence, the genetic and the archaeological, converge on the same conclusion. By the end of the Middle Pleistocene, clothing was a routine part of human life. But the Contrebandiers tools are not the oldest possible evidence. Stone scrapers suitable for hide working may date back to 400,000 years ago or earlier. That would place the first experiments with clothing in the era of Homo heidelbergensis, the common ancestor of Neanderthals and modern humans. If so, then clothing is not a uniquely sapiens innovation. It is a deeper, older human inheritance, refined over hundreds of millennia. The labor economics of beads. Let us return to the beads because they hold a key that most discussions of clothing history overlook. Beads are not free. They cost time, skill, and materials. And that cost is not incidental. It is the point. A bead from the Sungir burial represents about an hour of labor. A bead from the Copper Age site of Montelirio in Spain, dated to around 5,000 years ago, took about 11 minutes to produce,
according to experimental replication. That difference in production time reflects changes in technology and social organization over tens of millennia. But in both cases, the labor investment is real and substantial. The Montelirio assemblage is staggering. Approximately 270,769 shell beads, weighing 13 to 15 kilograms, requiring an estimated 49,500 hours of labor. That is nearly 6 years of full-time work by one person or dozens of people working for weeks. These beads were not everyday wear. They were ceremonial, probably worn only by women of exceptionally high status, and they were buried with their owners, never to be used again. The sheer scale of this labor investment forces us to reconsider our assumptions about early societies. These were not small egalitarian bands where everyone shared equally. They were complex, stratified societies, in which some individuals commanded far more labor than others. And the primary medium for displaying that command was clothing. The beaded garments of Montelirio, of Sungir, of countless other prehistoric sites are not just clothing, they are financial statements. They say in a language without words, I have resources, I have command over other people's time, I am not like you. This is the uncomfortable truth that the standard story, humans started wearing clothes to keep warm, cannot accommodate. Warmth is a function. Status is a signal. Functions can be met in many ways. Signals must be conspicuous. The earliest clothing, as the beads demonstrate, was not conspicuous because it was warm. It was conspicuous because it was costly. And the costliness, not the warmth, was the reason it worked, from naked skin to decorated garment. We are now in a position to trace the trajectory. It begins with the naked body, painted with ochre, decorated with feathers and shells. The body itself is the medium, and the signals are visible to everyone. Then as the climate cools or as people move into colder regions, the body must be covered. The old medium, bare skin, disappears beneath layers of fur and hide. But the need to signal does not disappear. If anything, it intensifies because social complexity is increasing alongside technological complexity. So the signals move from the skin to the garment, from ochre patterns to beadwork, from temporary paint to permanent ornament. The garment becomes the new canvas, and because the garment is itself a technology, the signals can become far more elaborate than anything possible with paint alone. The eyed needle is the tool that made this transfer possible. With an eyed needle, you can sew beads onto a garment securely. You can create complex patterns, attach fringes, build layered ensembles that communicate multiple messages at once. Group affiliation, rank, wealth, marital status, perhaps even personal history, recorded in the arrangement of beads. By 30,000 years ago at Sungir, that transfer was complete. The people buried there wore virtually nothing on their bodies that was not covered by beaded clothing. Their faces are not painted. Their chests are not decorated with ochre. The signal is now entirely in the beads. Thousands upon thousands of beads, sewn into the fur and the hide, with bone needles and sinew thread. This is not a story of necessity. This is a story of detour. Necessity, the need for warmth, drove people to cover their bodies. But once covered, they invented a new way to signal what they had always signaled: status, belonging, value. The bead is not a response to the cold. It is a response to the loss of visibility. The cold stole the naked body as a canvas. The bead gave back something even more powerful. The bead as fossil thought.
There is one final dimension to the bead that we have not yet considered, and it is perhaps the most important of all. A bead is not just an ornament. It is a fossilized thought. To make a bead, you must first have a concept of the bead, an abstract idea of a small object that can be perforated, strung, and worn. You must have a concept of the wearer, of the audience, of the message that the bead will convey. You must have a concept of the future because the bead will be worn tomorrow, not just today. You must have a theory of mind because you must imagine how others will interpret your beads. The presence of beads in the archaeological record, then, is not just evidence of ornament. It is evidence of a particular kind of cognition, symbolic thinking, mental time travel, recursive social intelligence. These are precisely the capacities that define modern human cognition, and the beads show that they were present in Africa by 75,000 years ago at the latest, and probably much earlier. This is the true significance of the 100,000-year-old bead. It is not the oldest bead. That honor may go to perforated shells from Algeria dated to 90,000 years ago, or to nacreous beads from Israel dated to over 100,000 years ago. But the Blombos beads are the most thoroughly studied, the most securely dated, the most certain, and they tell us that 75,000 years ago, humans were already engaging in the kind of symbolic behavior that we once thought emerged only 40,000 years ago with the so-called creative explosion of European Upper Paleolithic art. The creative explosion was not an explosion, it was a slow burn, and it started in Africa. The beads of Blombos are the first embers. The unasked question, revisited. But there is a question that the bead does not answer, a gap in the story that no one has yet filled. The beads from Blombos are 75,000 years old. The hide scrapers from contrebandiers are 90,000 to 120,000 years old. The Lice divergence is 170,000 to 100,000 years old. All of these dates cluster in a window between 170,000 and 75,000 years ago. Something happened in that window. But what? The answer, I suspect, is scarcity. Not scarcity of food or water, but scarcity of social information. As human populations grew and social groups became larger and more complex, the old signals, the ones based on naked skin and natural features, became insufficient. In a band of 30 people, everyone knows everyone. Signals can be simple because context does most of the work. In a tribe of 150, the size that Robin Dunbar famously identified as the limit of human social cognition, you need more robust signals. You need markers that can be read at a distance by strangers without explanation. Clothing and beads provided those markers. A person wearing a necklace of nacreous shells is not just a person. They are a person from a particular group with a particular status, making a particular claim about their value. The bead is a badge. It replaces the face-to-face familiarity of the small band with the abstract categories of the larger society. This is the deep history of fashion. Fashion is not trivial. It is not a distraction from the serious business of survival. Fashion is the technology that allowed humans to live in larger and larger groups without losing the ability to distinguish friend from foe, ally from rival, high status from low. Fashion is the original social network, and it started with a bead 75,000 years ago in a cave on the southern coast of Africa, the fig leaf fallacy. There is a scene that exists in the imagination of every Westerner who has ever thought about the origin of clothes, whether they know it or not. It comes from the book of Genesis, though most people remember it as a cartoon.
Adam and Eve, having eaten the forbidden fruit, suddenly realize they are naked. They look down at themselves. They feel shame for the first time. They sew fig leaves together and cover their genitals. And then when God walks in the garden, they hide. This story, this single, culturally specific, theologically loaded story, has shaped the Western understanding of clothing more than any archaeological discovery ever will. The fig leaf is not just a piece of vegetation. It is a symbol of a particular belief that the primary function of clothing is to conceal the sexual organs, that nakedness is inherently shameful, and that the desire to cover the body is a universal human instinct rather than a local cultural construction. Every single part of that belief is wrong. The fig leaf is a fallacy. Not because the story of Adam and Eve is fictional. Every origin story is fictional in its details, but because it has been mistaken for a universal truth. The historical and ethnographic evidence tells a very different story. For most of human existence, for most of the places humans have lived, covering the genitals was not the primary purpose of clothing. In many cases, it was not even a secondary purpose. In some cases, it was not a purpose at all. The real history of modesty, of the feeling that nudity is wrong, embarrassing, or dangerous, is not a story of instinct. It is a story of power, property, and the invention of patriarchy, the naked body in the archaeological record. Let us begin with a simple observation that should be obvious but is almost never stated. The archaeological record contains no evidence of genital covering until very, very late. We have beads from 75,000 years ago. We have hide scrapers from 120,000 years ago. We have bone awls and eyed needles from 50,000 years ago. We have the graves of Sungir, where children were buried in beaded costumes that covered their entire bodies. But nowhere in the archaeological record of the Middle Stone Age or the Upper Paleolithic do we find any evidence of garments specifically designed to cover the genitals as opposed to covering the body generally. This is not just an absence of evidence, it is an absence that speaks. If the primary motivation for wearing clothes was modesty, the desire to hide the sexual organs, we would expect to see a pattern. First, something to cover the loins. Then gradually, more extensive covering. But that is not what we see. What we see is the opposite. The first clothing seems to have covered the torso and limbs, not the genitals. The oldest depictions of human clothing, the Venus figurines, the cave paintings, the engraved bone plaques, show people wearing belts, armbands, necklaces, skirts, leggings, headdresses, but the genitals, often exposed, often emphasized. Consider the Venus of Willendorf, carved around 25,000 years ago. She wears a kind of hat or woven cap on her head. Her arms are folded over her breasts, but her vulva is prominently displayed. The figurine does not seem to be hiding anything. If anything, it is showing off. Consider the Venus of Lesbug from roughly the same period. She wears a fringe or skirt around her hips, but her pubic triangle is clearly visible below it. The skirt is not a modesty garment, it is an accent, a frame for the very thing that modesty would supposedly hide. Consider the hundreds of Paleolithic female figurines from across Europe and Siberia. Many are naked. Some wear belts or straps. Some wear what appear to be woven skirts or aprons. But none, literally none, show any evidence of a genital covering that could be interpreted as a fig leaf in the biblical sense. The body is displayed, not concealed. The same pattern appears in the oldest known representations of clothed humans. The paintings of the Tassili Niger Plateau in Algeria, dated to 10,000 to 6,000 years ago. These pastoralist rock art images show people wearing elaborate headdresses, sashes and belts, often with decorative elements hanging from the waist. But the genitals of both men and women are almost always visible. The clothing is added to the body, not substituted for it. It adorns. It does not obscure. The ethnographic record confirms this pattern. When European explorers first encountered the peoples of the Amazon, the Pacific Islands, and sub-Saharan Africa, they found societies where nudity was the norm, where genital covering was minimal or absent, and where the idea that nakedness was shameful was met with incomprehension. The Yanomami of Venezuela wore penis strings, a thin cord tied around the waist with a small sheath for the tip of the penis, but they did not wear this to hide themselves. The penis string, as the anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon noted, is purely decorative and functional, keeping the foreskin retracted. It hides nothing. The men walk around with their testicles fully exposed. The women wear nothing at all. And no one feels shame. The Ache of Paraguay, studied by Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado, traditionally wore no clothing whatsoever, except for occasional decorative belts or armbands. They did not consider themselves naked because they had no concept of nudity as a problem. Nakedness was simply the human condition. The body was not something to hide. The Kung San of the Kalahari, often cited as a model for early human behavior, traditionally wore only a small loin covering for men and an apron for women. But these coverings were minimal, often transparent, and their primary function was not modesty but hygiene, preventing dust from entering the vagina during the dry season and protection against insect bites. When asked about shame, the Kung did not associate it with the body. They associated it with behavior, stinginess, greed, failure to share meat. Nakedness was not shameful. Being naked while your neighbor was hungry, that was shameful. What these examples teach us is that the link between nudity and shame is not universal. It is culturally specific. And cultures that lack that link are not primitive or less evolved. They are simply different. They have different histories, different values, different ways of organizing social life. The fig leaf is not a universal human impulse. It is a local invention, one that spread with agriculture, property, and the state. The Greek invention of nudity. If the fig leaf is a fallacy, where did it come from? The answer is surprising. The Greeks. Not the Greeks of the classical period, who we think of as comfortable with nudity, but the Greeks of the Archaic period who invented the very concept of gymnos, the word from which we get gymnasium. The story of Greek nudity is one of the great paradoxes of cultural history. The Greeks are famous for their celebration of the naked male body, the Kouroi statues, the Olympic Games, the gymnasiums where men exercised in the nude. But what we forget is that this celebration was not a continuation of some primeval natural state. It was a revolution. Before the Greeks, in the ancient Near East, Egypt, and Crete, nudity was not a public spectacle. People wore clothes. The Egyptians wore linen kilts. The Minoans wore loincloths and elaborate skirts. The Mesopotamians wore woolen garments that covered the entire body. Nudity was for slaves, captives, and the dead. Then, sometime around the 8th or 7th century BCE, the Greeks began to do something strange.
They started exercising naked. The word gymnos, naked, became the root of gymnasium, the place where young men trained. The Olympics, founded in 776 BCE, were performed in the nude. Athletes anointed themselves with oil, ran, wrestled, threw the discus and the javelin, all without a stitch of clothing. Why? The standard explanation is that a runner named Orsippus of Megara lost his loincloth during a race and won more easily, so everyone copied him. But that is a folk etymology, not history. A more plausible explanation is that Greek athletic nudity was a class marker. Only free citizens could be nude in public. Slaves, foreigners, and women were not permitted. Nudity signified status. I am so free that I do not even need to cover my body. I am so confident in my self-control that I can display my penis without fear of losing control. This is the opposite of modesty. This is display as dominance, and it only works because in most other contexts, the Greeks were not nude. They wore clothes in daily life. They covered their bodies in the marketplace, at the symposium, at home. The nudity of the gymnasium was a ritualized exception, a temporary suspension of the normal rules, and its power came precisely from that suspension. But the Greek invention of athletic nudity had a second, deeper consequence. It separated the body into two spheres. The public, male, athletic body naked, celebrated, idealized, and the private, female, non-athletic body, covered, hidden, associated with shame. This separation would be inherited by the Romans, and then, through Christianity, by the entire Western world. The famous Greek statues of nude youths, the kouroi, are not natural. They are ideological. They present an image of the male body as perfect, self-contained, worthy of public display. The female body, by contrast, is almost never shown nude in Greek art of the Archaic period. When it appears, it is clothed, draped, hidden. The first major nude female statue, the Aphrodite of Knidos by Praxiteles, 4th century BCE, was considered scandalous. Men traveled to Knidos just to see it. Women presumably were not supposed to look, so the Greek attitude toward nudity was not simple. It was stratified by gender, status, and context. Nudity for men could be heroic. Nudity for women was shameful. Nudity in the gymnasium was normal. Nudity in the agora was indecent. The fig leaf had not yet arrived, but the seeds were planted. The Roman reversal. The Romans inherited the Greek attitude toward nudity and then turned it upside down. Roman culture was, in many ways, more modest than Greek culture. Men and women both wore the toga or stola in public, garments that covered the body from neck to ankle. Public bathing was practiced, but men and women bathed separately until the later empire, when mixed bathing became common and was criticized by moralists. The Roman attitude toward the body was more pragmatic than idealistic. The Greeks celebrated the male form. The Romans covered it. But the Romans also introduced something new: the association of nudity with defeat and humiliation. When Roman soldiers were captured, they were stripped naked before execution. When a general celebrated a triumph, the defeated enemy leaders were paraded naked in chains. Nudity was not freedom, as it was for the Greeks. Nudity was vulnerability. To be naked was to be powerless. This is the thread that leads, through Christianity, to the fig leaf. In Roman thinking, the body is not inherently shameful, but it is inherently weak. It can be hurt, shamed, exposed. The purpose of clothing is not just to protect the body from the elements.
It is to protect the dignity of the person, to cover the soft, vulnerable places where shame might enter. The early Christians, living in the Roman Empire, inherited this Roman anxiety about nudity, but they added a new twist: the body as temptation. Paul of Tarsus, writing in the 1st century CE, urged women to cover their heads because of the angels. 1 Corinthians 11:10, an obscure phrase, but one that clearly links covering with sexual propriety. The body, especially the female body, was seen as a source of sinful desire. To cover it was not just to protect dignity, it was to prevent sin. This is the direct ancestor of the fig leaf. The fig leaf in Genesis is not about vulnerability or weakness. It is about guilt. Adam and Eve cover themselves because they have sinned, and the recognition of sin brings shame. The body is not innocent. It is culpable. And clothing is not just a garment. It is a confession. This theological framework, the body is sinful, nudity is shameful, covering as repentance, has no basis in prehistory. It is not a universal human truth. It is a specific invention of late Roman and early Christian culture, one that would be exported around the world through colonialism and missionization. The fig leaf is not the origin of clothing. It is the origin of Western guilt about clothing, the agricultural shift. But if the Greeks, Romans, and Christians invented modesty as we know it, what changed in human societies to make that invention possible? The answer, as so often in human history, is agriculture. The shift from foraging to farming, which began around 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent and spread independently in several other parts of the world, transformed every aspect of human life. Diet, settlement patterns, social organization, and crucially, property relations. In foraging societies, resources are shared. Food is consumed quickly. Ownership is transient. In agricultural societies, land is owned. Grain can be stored. Wealth accumulates, and with accumulation comes inequality, and with inequality comes the need to control reproduction. Here is the connection, and it is the missing link that explains why genital covering became important in some societies and not others. In agricultural societies, men typically own land, livestock, and stored wealth. They want to pass this wealth to their own children, not to the children of their neighbors. But in a world before DNA testing, how can a man be sure that a child is his? The only way is to control the woman's sexuality, to ensure that she has sex only with him, to mark her as his property. And the most visible way to mark a woman as owned is to cover her body. The veil, the burqa, the chador, the headscarf, these are not primarily about modesty or religion. They are about property. They say to every other man, this woman belongs to someone else. Do not look, do not touch, do not even think about her. This is not speculation. It is well established in the anthropological literature. The anthropologist Sherry Ortner argued that the subordination of women is linked to the control of reproduction, and that one of the primary mechanisms of that control is the regulation of female dress. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, studying the Kabyle people of Algeria, showed how women's clothing marked their status as protected property. The feminist scholar Leila Ahmed, in her History of Veiling, demonstrated that veiling existed in the ancient Near East before Islam, and that it was associated with elite women, those whose sexuality was most valuable to their male guardians. Consider the veiling practices of ancient Assyria. A law code from the 13th century BCE prescribes the veil for respectable women and prohibits it for prostitutes and slaves, the veil is not a religious requirement. It is a class marker. It distinguishes the woman who is owned from the woman who is not. Consider the practice of purdah seclusion in South Asia. Women of high caste families are expected to cover their bodies and avoid contact with unrelated men. This is not a universal practice. Lower caste women often work in the fields uncovered because their labor is needed. Purdah is a luxury good, a signal of status. It says, "I am so wealthy that the women of my family do not need to work. They can afford to be hidden." The burqa in Afghanistan, the chador in Iran, the hijab in many Muslim societies. These are not ancient traditions. They are relatively recent innovations, often enforced by political movements seeking to control women's bodies as part of a nationalist or religious project. The Islamic Republic of Iran made veiling mandatory in 1983. Saudi Arabia's requirement that women wear the abaya dates primarily to the 20th century. These are not the timeless customs they are presented to be. They are political garments, and they are the direct descendants of the fig leaf. Not the fig leaf of Genesis, that was about sin, but the fig leaf of agricultural patriarchy, the covering of the female body to mark it as male property, the naked body as political statement. If modesty and covering are linked to patriarchy and property, then nakedness becomes, in certain contexts, a political act. This is the insight of feminist scholarship on dress, and it explains why the question of nudity has been so contentious throughout history. When the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s staged bra burnings, mostly symbolic, few bras were actually burned. They were not trying to be immodest. They were rejecting the idea that women's bodies needed to be contained, shaped, hidden. They were claiming the right to be comfortable in their own skin. The backlash was ferocious because the stakes were high. If women can uncover their bodies, they can also control their reproduction, their labor, their lives. When the Free the Nipple movement advocates for the right of women to go topless in public, it is not just about breasts. It is about the double standard that criminalizes female nipples while ignoring male ones. The double standard is not natural, it is cultural, and it serves the same function as the veil, to mark the female body as different, as dangerous, as in need of control. When indigenous activists in the Amazon or the Pacific contest the imposition of Western clothing on their communities, they are not being backward. They are asserting a different relationship to the body, one in which nudity is not shameful, not sexual, not dangerous. They are rejecting the fig leaf, not because they are primitive, but because they have a different understanding of what it means to be human. The fig leaf in art history. Let us end this part with a brief tour through the fig leaf in Western art, because its history reveals everything about the fallacy we have been tracing. In the original Genesis narrative, Adam and Eve sew fig leaves together to cover themselves. But for most of Christian art history, artists did not depict the fig leaf. They depicted the couple covering themselves with their hands or with a branch, or, in the case of Masaccio's famous fresco in the Brancacci Chapel 1425, with a large leaf that is not clearly a fig. The fig leaf as a distinct motif emerged later in the 16th and 17th centuries as a way to navigate the church's discomfort with nudity. The most famous fig leaf in history is not in the Bible. It is in the Vatican. In 1564, The Council of Trent decreed that religious images should avoid lasciviousness. In response, Pope Pius V ordered that the genitals of Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel be painted over. The painter Daniele da Volterra was hired to cover the offending parts. He added breeches, drapery, and, on the figure of Adam, a large fig leaf. Daniele da Volterra was thereafter known as Il Bragattone, the breeches maker. His additions remained on the fresco for centuries, only removed during the most recent restoration 1990 to 1994. But here's the irony that cuts to the heart of the fig leaf fallacy. Michelangelo's Adam was not ashamed. He was not hiding. He was reaching toward God, fully human, fully naked, fully alive. The fig leaf was not part of Michelangelo's vision. It was imposed later by a church that had become more fearful of the body than the Renaissance had been. The fig leaf is not a return to some original state of innocence. It is a censorship. And that, in the end, is the real story of the fig leaf. It is not the first garment. It is not the origin of clothing. It is a late, specific, politically charged addition to a story that had no fig leaf to begin with. The unasked question, again. So why do we believe that covering the genitals was the primary reason humans leaf feels so natural, so obvious, so right? Because we have been told this story over and over for 2,000 years. From the pulpit, from the schoolroom, from the television. The story of Adam and Eve is not just a story. It is a script for how to think about the body. And like all scripts, it can be rewritten. The archaeological and ethnographic evidence gives us permission to rewrite it. The first clothes were not fig leaves. They were not about shame. They were about warmth, yes, and about parasites, and about status, and about beauty. The genitals were not the focus. The focus was the whole body. The body as a canvas, as a signal, as a statement of who you were and where you belonged. The covering of the genitals came later, and it came with agriculture, property, and patriarchy. It came with the need to control women's bodies, to mark them as owned, to hide them from other men. That is not a universal human truth. It is a historical accident, a powerful one, to be sure, one that has shaped the lives of billions, but an accident nonetheless. The fig leaf is not the first garment. It is the last rationalization. The female orgasm as driver of textile innovation. We have arrived at the forbidden question. It is the question that anthropologists whisper in conference bars after the third glass of wine, the question that grant reviewers flag as speculative, the question that textbook authors tiptoe around as if the mere act of asking might cause the ceiling to fall. Here it is. Did the female orgasm, specifically its unpredictability, its dependence on context, and its evolutionary function as a mate choice mechanism, drive the invention of clothing? The question sounds absurd only because we have been trained to think of clothing as either practical warmth, protection, or moral modesty, shame. But if the arguments of the previous four parts hold, that clothing is primarily a signaling technology, that the body is a canvas for social information, that the covering of genitals is a late and local invention, then we must confront the possibility that the most intimate of human experiences shaped the most mundane of human artifacts. This part will not provide definitive answers. The evidence is too sparse, the cultural stakes too high, the risk of projecting modern biases onto the past too great. But it will ask the question honestly. Lay out the competing hypotheses.
and suggest a way forward that respects both the science and the sensitivity of the topic. The puzzle of the hidden ovulation. Let us begin with a biological fact that is stranger than most people realize. Among the roughly 4,000 species of mammals, only a handful have concealed ovulation, that is, ovulation that is not advertised to males by visible or olfactory signals. Humans are one of them. The others include some bats, some primates. Bonobos have partially concealed ovulation and a few others. But the vast majority of mammals advertise their fertile period loudly and clearly. Female chimpanzees develop a large pink swelling on their genitals. Female baboons do the same. Female dogs have a bloody discharge. Female rats produce a distinct odor. These signals are not incidental. They are costly. The swelling requires energy. The odor attracts predators. And they have evolved precisely because they benefit the female. By advertising her fertile window, a female primate ensures that males compete for access to her, and she can choose the best competitor. She also ensures that mating happens when conception is possible, not wasting her limited reproductive opportunities. So why did humans lose this signal? Why do human females ovulate in silence, showing no outward sign, often not even knowing it themselves? The standard answer, proposed by the anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy in her 1981 book, The Woman That Never Evolved, and elaborated by many others, is that concealed ovulation evolved to promote pair bonding. The logic goes like this. If a male cannot tell when a female is fertile, he cannot simply mate with her during her fertile window and then leave. He must stay with her, mate with her regularly, and provide food and protection to ensure that any offspring are his. Concealed ovulation thus favored the evolution of monogamy, paternal investment, and the nuclear family. This is a tidy story. It has dominated textbooks for 4 decades, but it has problems. First, it assumes that males are only interested in investing in offspring they are certain are theirs. But human males invest heavily in children, even in cultures where paternity certainty is low. The AKA of Central Africa, for example, are among the most involved fathers in the world. Yet they have no concept of paternity in the Western sense. A man is the father of a child if he is married to the mother at the time of birth, regardless of biological paternity. Investment does not require certainty. Second, concealed ovulation is not unique to pair bonding species. Bonobos, our closest living relatives along with chimpanzees, have partially concealed ovulation. Their swellings are smaller and less conspicuous than chimpanzees, yet they are not pair bonded. They live in multi-male, multi-female groups with frequent promiscuous mating. Concealed ovulation in bonobos seems to serve a different function. It reduces male-male competition and allows females to mate with multiple males, confusing paternity and reducing the risk of infanticide. Third, the pair bonding hypothesis cannot explain why concealed ovulation evolved in the first place. It is a classic just so story. We have the trait. We imagine a benefit. We assume the benefit caused the evolution. But traits can evolve for one reason and later be co-opted for another. The evolutionary pathway matters. A different hypothesis, proposed by the primatologist Craig Stanford and others, is that concealed ovulation evolved to reduce male coercion. In species where females are continuously sexually receptive, more on that in a moment, males who know when a female is fertile may harass and coerce her during that window. By hiding the window, females gain more control over mating. They can mate when they choose, with whom they choose, without being targeted at their most vulnerable time. This hypothesis has the advantage of being consistent with the broader pattern of female sexual autonomy in humans, a pattern that is rare among mammals but pronounced in our lineage. But it still leaves a key question unanswered. Why would females be continuously receptive in the first place? The great anomaly. Here's the fact that changes everything. Human females are not just capable of sex at any time in their cycle. They are motivated to have sex at times when conception is impossible, during pregnancy, during lactation, after menopause. They experience sexual desire, sexual pleasure, and sexual initiation across their entire reproductive lifespan, not just during a brief fertile window. This is not true of most mammals. A female rat in the non-estrus phase will actively reject a male, sometimes violently. A female dog will not allow mounting outside of her heat. A female chimpanzee shows little interest in sex when she is not swollen. The human pattern, continuous female receptivity, is evolutionarily rare, and it demands an explanation. The most influential explanation comes from the work of the anthropologist Donald Simmons, whose 1979 book, The Evolution of Human Sexuality, argued that female orgasm is a byproduct of male orgasm, not an adaptation in its own right. The clitoris and the penis develop from the same embryonic tissue. Orgasm is what happens when that tissue is stimulated. Since male orgasm is essential for reproduction, the neural hardware for orgasm evolved in males, and females inherited it as a developmental side effect. Female orgasm, in this view, is like male nipples, present, sometimes functional, but not an adaptation. This byproduct hypothesis has been defended by the philosopher of biology, Elizabeth Lloyd, in her 2005 book, The Case of the Female Orgasm. Lloyd reviewed the evidence, physiological, anatomical, comparative, and clinical, and concluded that there is no compelling evidence that female orgasm has an evolutionary function. It is simply a happy accident. But the byproduct hypothesis has never satisfied everyone. For one thing, female orgasm is not trivial. It involves distinct physiological responses, increased blood flow to the genitals, rhythmic contractions of the pelvic floor muscles, release of oxytocin and prolactin, changes in pain perception and emotional state. This is a complex, energy-expending, hormonally mediated process. Evolution does not typically maintain complex traits that serve no function. Male nipples are simple. Female orgasm is not. The alternative hypothesis, proposed by the primatologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy and the anthropologist Beverly Strassman, among others, is that female orgasm evolved as a mate choice mechanism. The idea is that women who orgasm more easily with certain partners are more likely to choose those partners, and the traits that trigger orgasm, good health, genetic compatibility, attentive behavior, social status, are precisely the traits that would benefit offspring. Orgasm is a reward that guides mating decisions. This hypothesis has some empirical support. Studies have shown that women report more frequent and intense orgasms with partners they find attractive, with partners who invest in them, and during certain phases of the menstrual cycle that coincide with higher fertility. Women also report fewer orgasms with partners who have genetic profiles similar to their own, suggesting that orgasm may be a mechanism for avoiding inbreeding. The data are messy, but they point in a direction. Orgasm is not random, but neither the byproduct hypothesis nor the mate choice hypothesis directly addresses the question of clothing. To make that connection, we need a third hypothesis, one that is rarely discussed in polite academic company. Let us call it the social regulation hypothesis. The social regulation hypothesis. Here is the argument in its strongest form, stripped of euphemism. Continuous female sexual receptivity creates a social problem that no other primate faces. In a band of 30 humans, at any given moment, multiple individuals may be sexually interested in multiple others, not just during a brief fertile window, but all the time. This is not a recipe for constant orgy. Human sexuality is heavily regulated by social norms, taboos, and personal preferences. But the potential for sexual activity is always present, and that potential must be managed. How do humans manage it? Through a vast and intricate system of signals, body language, eye contact, verbal negotiation, and, crucially, clothing. Clothing in this framework is not primarily about hiding the body. It is about coding the body. It provides a set of signals that answer the questions. Is this person available? Under what conditions? To whom? A garment can signal available to everyone, available to no one, available only to my spouse, available only after a ritual, available only if you have high status. These signals are not foolproof. People misread them constantly. But they are necessary because the naked body, in a species with continuous receptivity, sends too ambiguous a message. Consider what the naked body signals in a species with no continuous receptivity. A female chimpanzee who is not swollen is effectively saying not interested. Her body is honest. A female human who is naked is not saying anything specific at all. She could be interested. She could be completely disinterested. She could be indifferent. Her body does not tell you. And that ambiguity is dangerous. Not because sex is dangerous, but because unwanted sex is dangerous. Misreading a signal or having your signal misread can lead to coercion, conflict, violence. Clothing reduces the ambiguity. It adds information. It says, I am in this social role right now, and that role has specific rules about sexual access. The business suit says, do not approach me sexually during work hours. The revealing evening gown says, approach with caution. I may be interested, but you must follow the rituals of courtship, the wedding ring. A form of clothing, an adornment, says, I am claimed. The headscarf says, I am not available to men outside my family. None of these signals are universal. They vary across cultures, but the function is universal. To reduce the ambiguity of the naked, continuously receptive body. The female orgasm as signal regulator. Now we bring the orgasm back in. Because the female orgasm is not just a pleasure response, it is also a learning mechanism. Women learn over time which contexts, which partners, which behaviors are associated with orgasm, and that learning shapes their dress choices. The evidence for this is ethnographic, not archaeological, but it is suggestive. In many societies, women wear different clothing depending on their sexual intentions. Among the Sambia of Papua New Guinea, studied by Gilbert Hurt, unmarried girls wore short grass skirts that revealed their genitals when they sat or bent over. Married women wore longer skirts that covered more. The change in dress marked a change in sexual availability, and the change was enforced by both men and women. Women who violated the dress code were punished. Among the Nuer of South Sudan, studied by E. Evans Pritchard, young unmarried women wore only a short beaded apron that covered the genitals minimally.
Married women wore a longer skirt of cowhide. Again, dress signaled sexual status, and again, the signal was tied to reproductive function, but not to ovulation, which remained hidden. The dress signaled social status, not biological state. These examples could be interpreted as simple patriarchy, men controlling women's bodies through dress. And that interpretation is partly correct. But it misses the possibility that women themselves use dress to manage sexual attention and to reduce unwanted advances, to signal their own preferences. A woman who wears a headscarf in a conservative society is not necessarily a victim of patriarchy. She may be using dress to carve out a space of non-availability, to reduce the cognitive load of constant sexual vigilance, to move through public space without being harassed. This is the hypothesis: the female orgasm, with its context sensitivity and its role in mate choice, created selective pressure for more information about sexual availability, not less. And clothing, specifically the social coding of clothing, provided that information. Women who could signal their availability or non-availability effectively had better sexual outcomes. Fewer unwanted advances, more desired matings, lower risk of coercion, higher likelihood of orgasm with preferred partners. Over evolutionary time, this selective pressure shaped both the psychology of dress, the feeling that certain clothes are appropriate or inappropriate, and the technology of dress, the invention of garments that could be easily put on, taken off, modified, or layered. The burqa and the bikini are opposite ends of a single spectrum. Both are technologies for managing sexual attention. One says stay away, the other says approach, but only in this context: the archaeological gap. If this hypothesis is correct, we should find evidence of clothing that is specifically designed to signal sexual availability or non-availability. Do we? The answer is complicated. The oldest clothing, the hides and plant fibers of the Middle Stone Age, preserves too poorly to tell us much about cut or fit. But we have indirect evidence. The beads of Blombos and the ochre of Deep Kloof suggest that early clothing was decorated, and decoration is a form of signaling. Some of that signaling may have been about sexual status. Consider the Venus figurines again. Many of them wear belts or girdles that emphasize the waist and hips. Some wear what appear to be woven bands around the upper thighs, creating a kind of garter effect. These are not functional garments. They do not cover or warm. They are accentuating garments, drawing attention to the sexual features of the female body. The message is not cover yourself. The message is look here. This is the opposite of modesty. It is display. And it suggests that one of the oldest functions of clothing, as old as the bead itself, was to make the body more sexually legible, not less. The belt makes the waist look smaller. The garter draws the eye to the thigh. The necklace frames the breasts. Clothing, from its very beginnings, was used to sexualize the body, not to desexualize it. The fig leaf in this light is not the origin. It is a deviation. A local, late, culturally specific invention that reversed the older trend. For most of human prehistory, clothing was not about hiding sex. It was about advertising sex, but advertising it in a controlled, coded, context-specific way. The unasked question finally asked, let us be direct. The hypothesis of this part, and it remains a hypothesis, not a conclusion, is that the female orgasm, because it is context-sensitive and linked to mate choice, created an evolutionary pressure for clothing as a signaling technology.
women and men needed to communicate their availability, their preferences, their status, and their boundaries.